Venezuela, having to buy it from now Iran, Russia. We're going head to head with Putin. He no longer can control the oil market in the Middle East. So we empowered our allies, regardless of what the president has failed foreign policy. We did something that now we have influence in the worldwide market now. In the 10-day window from when the president signed the bill to that first tanker left the port of Corpus Christi, there had been a pipeline that ran to a 60-mile long pipeline that had been sitting idle for decades. It got turned on and started pumping oil. 2 other pipelines that had actually been built to pump imported oil inland, engineers were sent out to reverse it. It's been reversed, and now it's pumping oil down to the port. They started construction on a $1 billion pipeline and immediately started construction on new docks in the port of Corpus Christi. In 10 days, this happened. Corpus Christi went from a recession town into a boom town in 10 days. Jobs, they're in demand for jobs. This is happening all across America because of that one act. I could go on and on. I've been on a counterterrorism task force for several months. It's gone by quick. We came out with 32 issues that we found with our national security. One of those was a refugee program. How many of you knew we actually passed out of the House a bill halting the refugee resettlement program with a veto-proof majority? Yeah, passed the House with a veto-proof majority. Enough Democrats voted on it. It's in the Senate. They're considering taking it up right now. And we're pushing them to do that. A lot of people say, well, in the omnibus, you didn't defund the refugee program. The problem is, in a spending bill, you're kind of limited in what you can do policy. And we had already passed it out of the House with a veto-proof majority. If we had done it in the omnibus, it would have undercut what we're doing to actually make a permanent solution to this. So, one of those recommendations of our 32 things we had to do immediately was our visa waiver program. That was a huge vulnerability we had. Without going into details, it was easy to exploit. We actually closed that loophole in the visa waiver program. The president signed it, so we've made a major step there. Now, there's several more things we do. There were 5 pro-life decisions, natural right to life, held, that were huge victories for us this year. We made significant tax cuts. All the several temporary tax provisions, we made them permanent this year. So you had no idea there were that many victories out of that the president actually signed. So when you look at it, when we're on a battlefield that doesn't really favor us, we're actually getting some pretty good victories. But the media doesn't want you to know that. Do you know that everything that I just told you, they were all in the omnibus? That bill that was so terrible that it was the worst thing Republicans ever passed, including the lifting of the oil export ban. The biggest thing that was in the omnibus bill, and one of the reasons I voted, because many of you have, I wouldn't say in the room here, but there's many people out there who have expressed their deeply held concerns that I have sold out to the establishment. One of the things I've been preaching about going into Congress as a member of the House Freedom Caucus is back to Washington and the battlefield. Is Washington had to have the right rules of engagement and the right battlefield before he would engage, because he knew that's what it took to take him out. The rules of engagement and the battlefield that we were playing upon was totally against conservatives. It's the way it was. It's the way it is a lot in the state, House and Senate as well. Because the Speaker of the House was so empowered, he ran everything. Committees couldn't really do their work because he dictated what came out of committee. If you wanted to get a bill passed, you had to buddy up to the Speaker. A regular rank and file member of Congress had no say-so. So deep pocket folks a lot of times have more influence than the rank and file members of what moved and what didn't. The rules of engagement did not favor us, so the first thing that we had to do was change the policy, change the procedures, change the rules. And if the leader didn't go along with it, then we were going to have to change our leader. The House Freedom Caucus, and after a lot of preaching that I did, is our focus has to first be changing the procedures here. changing the culture in Washington, and that's what we started working on. The end result is we changed our leaders. From a conservative standpoint, we did a historic thing and we got rid of a Speaker of the House and we brought a new one in. Now, we took some criticism over our choice, but you know why the House Freedom Caucus, the strongest conservative members of the House, endorsed Paul Ryan? Because his commitment was to changing the culture in Washington, changing the process. Getting back to the rules of the House that our founders put in, and that's what we're operating under right now. That's why this year, you're going to see a totally change in Congress. You may have to look because the media is probably not going to prop us up very much about it. But here's what Paul Ryan told us. He said, when you play hockey, if you go to where the hockey puck is, you spend the entire game skating around the rink chasing the puck. You skate to where the puck is going to be. If we continue just reacting to everything that this president does, we're never going to accomplish everything. We have to go to where the puck is going to be. Our puck is January of 2017 when we have a new president. So we're putting in, thank you, we're putting in an agenda that actually sets a mandate for the new president that he comes in. Now, we're not going to accomplish a lot because if you define victory by what the president does, if he signs into law, it's not going to happen this year. But what we can do is set the agenda by passing out of the House of Representatives, or at least we've changed the rules so we can get these things to the floor. Things like securing the southern border, taking on an aggressive tax reform package, securing our nation, making sure our military is the best in the world. These are the things that we are going to be doing. And who decided what our agenda was? We did. It wasn't the Speaker came down and he said, this is going to be our agenda. We met in Baltimore, Maryland for 3 days and said, here's the major things that the people want. This is what the polling data is telling us the people want. Now let's build an individual agenda around that. We did it together. So we're empowered now. So next week, on February the 3rd, I'm kind of giving you in advance. I'll be doing a press conference with Senator Mike Lee of Utah, something that we've been working on. To use some military analogies, we've been the behind-the-scenes Delta Force guys working covertly to put things together before we just go out and launch. So we have a crack team of conservative members of Senate and the House that we put together what's called the Article 1 Project. If you know, if you pick up a copy of the Constitution, Article 1 defines the powers of the Congress, of the legislative branch. And that article starts off, all legislative powers are given to Congress. The House and Senate, all legislative powers. Think about that. Any ability to restrict your liberties by enacting law comes from Congress. That's not the way it's been for a few decades. Through executive orders, through creating a fourth branch of government, the regulatory agencies who self-fund themselves and claim that Congress can't tell them what to do, we've lost control of this nation and this federal government. Article 1 Project is a bringing together these conservative minds to say, how do we attack this problem and how are we going to regain that control on behalf of the American people? Very excited. One of the basis of this entire project, the foundation, the core piece of the Article 1 Project, something I know Lewis knows about, we've talked about it for a long time, an idea I had about federal government ought to have to balance its budget, and it ought to have a constitutional requirement to do it, right? There have been several balanced budget amendments, but one thing, again, we have to deal with reality. If we were to pass a balanced budget amendment this year and it was ratified next year, our entire economy would collapse. There's too much of our economy that is built upon the fact of debt and deficit spending. You have to have time to get out of it. When the economy collapsed in 2008 and my business went into deep debt, I had two options. I could declare bankruptcy, go on, and deal with life, but I couldn't do that. My personal integrity would not let me walk away from a debt that I owed, and I had employees that relied upon me doing everything I could to keep that business afloat. My wife and I put everything we had into that business. It broke us. But what I was doing was buying time by even putting my own money into this thing to keep it going. I was the first one to take a pay cut. I mean, I cut myself down to whatever I needed to pay mortgage and buy groceries. But I was buying time because I knew the more time I had, the more we could work out of it and get out of debt as a company and become profitable again. We're going to do that with the nation. It's going to take time to pay off an $18 trillion debt. I started off talking about Jesus entering Jerusalem, all right? Jesus started life in Bethlehem, right? 2016 years ago. If you went back to Bethlehem when Jesus was born and you put $16,000 in the bank, and every minute since Jesus was born, you repeated that process, every minute put $16,000 in the bank, you still wouldn't have $18 trillion today. That's how big the debt is. We got to have time to deal with this. So my balanced budget amendment says that Congress must operate under a balanced budget within 10 years of ratification. So it gives a deadline, and it becomes a catalyst. We're also going to be taking control of all the funds that are in these agencies. We're going to be doing civil service. You can't fire anybody from federal government service. That's a bill I'm working on right now. If you're not performing, you shouldn't be living off my taxpayer dollars, right? These are the things we're going to be doing under Article 1, reining in regulatory agencies and taking back the power of the purse. These are the things that we're operating on now. And the other thing is we've got to have a vision of where we're going as a nation. My office has got a project we've been working on called Vision 2030 that's being picked up. I've had several meetings with the speaker about this. You're hearing people talk more about vision. What do we want America to look like by the year 2030? If we can define that and we can start working toward that and put it in everyday terms, then we got to go. That's the shining city on a hill that Reagan talked about. Now we get all of us talking about the same goals and visions instead of arguing. Here's what happens. We argue about which road we're going to take before we even define where we're going. So, if we're going to win, and I believe we can win, I believe we're on the verge of actually having a significant shift in this nation, we better learn that the soldier on each side of us and in front of us and behind us, whose gun is initially pointing the same direction, they're not our enemy. We may not agree with everything they do. I took a lot of heat over omnibus. Let me tell you why I voted for it. Even with all these other things, I was going to be a no vote because it busted budget caps, and my main thing is we got to get rid of $18 trillion of debt. But what changed that? Now, it would have been a very weak no, and I wasn't going to condemn everybody because I knew what was in that bill, and it was the biggest win that we had ever had under a Democrat president. There was a provision put in that bill by a senator from Alabama that would have taken Georgia back to the 1950s levels of withdrawals of water from our rivers, streams, and lakes. The 1950s. Think about what Cartersville looked like in 1950 and how much water we used versus how much water we're using today. We would have been taken back to the 1950 level. I was on the phone with the governor and the director of our EPD, and he said, look, Barry, if this thing goes through, this is no joke. We would be rationing the water that people use. Not like during the drought when we told people they couldn't wash their cars. We'll be telling you when you can take a bath and when you can wash your clothes. We'll have to shut water off to people's businesses and homes. This is how significant this is. So, well, immediately we had a couple of days to work on this to get that thing revised. Went to the speaker, and the speaker said, look, I'll do everything I can to help you, but it's not going to be easy. He basically was willing to shut down Washington, D.C. to get this done. This was so important because my first obligation is to God, second is the Constitution, third is the people of my district. That's the way the founders set it up. You represent the people of your district, their will and interest first. So we brought David Perdue. Senator Perdue was another one who was going to vote against the omnibus for the same reason I was, and we talked to each other. He said, we've got to get this done. I said, well, I'm going to work everything I can to get this done. The speaker basically called over the Senate and said, look, I'll keep our folks here until Christmas, but this is coming out. And Speaker Ryan did a tremendous job. We were able to get the bill amended. I was with the House Freedom Caucus, and we were talking, and I let some of the guys know, said, look, this is what we're doing. I appreciate it if you guys wouldn't open it up for other amendments because you're really not supposed to be amending these things out on the floor. But this is so critical to Georgia, we have to get this done. They said, no problem. So one of the guys who's kind of our parliamentarian, he said, Barry, I just want to let you know if you successfully get this done. Jefferson's rules, you've been preaching about getting back to the policy, changing the policy and procedures and honoring those policies and procedures. Back that the founding fathers set up. Said Thomas Jefferson actually wrote into the Jeffersonian rules that govern the House, not a rule, but a principle. A principle. That if you successfully amend a bill, you're honor bound to then support the underlying measure. He says it's not a rule. You're not going to get kicked out of the House if you violate it, but it's a principle. If you successfully amend a bill, then you're expected to vote for it. So he says, I know how you are on process. And I said, so what do you think? He said, I'm glad I'm not you, is what I think. So as Desiree can tell you, it was some deep soul searching. In fact, Speaker Ryan called me at 8 o'clock at night before the vote, and we were talking, probably talked for, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes. She got to the point and said, will you get off the phone? And I'm sitting there thinking, this would have never happened to the previous speaker. He would have had some staff member call me and, as it happens with any legislative body, maybe lay down a threat, but we were just talking. And I said, so how is it going with this? He said, actually, it's not going very well because as the Democrats are actually reading the omnibus bill, their votes are falling off. Pelosi is having a hard time keeping on board because they're seeing all the stuff that I just told you about and all the permanent tax cuts that were in there. He said, I'm not going to tell you I don't need your vote because I don't know. I don't know where the rest of the guys are, but I know this is very difficult for you. And I said, well, Speaker, you don't have to tell me because you don't have to convince me because let me tell you where I am after doing a lot of soul searching here and what you did to fix the water problem in Georgia. It's not that I'm trying to get to yes because I don't want to get to yes. It's that I have to. I feel that I have to. If I'm going to be the person of integrity that I want to be, then I have to be a yes. We knew that what was going to happen, but we also knew this, that we're resilient as Americans. And if we can come together, there's nothing that we can't accomplish, including restoring our liberty. So as we go forward, I would ask this, keep an open mind, but with your eyes upon our cause of liberty. And as all the candidates are out there and they're talking, talk to them. Find out what they truly believe and find out what is their vision for the county. Find out what is their vision for the nation, for the state. Because it's not the sound bites that make the difference when it comes down to making a difficult vote, but it's the principles, it's the vision and the character of the person that's there and how they're going to stand. Now, any soldier can put on a uniform, but not every soldier will stand against an oncoming army without cutting and running. We'll stand the ground. So with that, any questions? Lewis hadn't started fanning me, so I don't know.
He's fanning them.
Yes.
And help me if I don't get this correct, but you talked about cutting back the EPA budget to the 2008 numbers. And we also talked about the good news of what's happening with oil in our country. So does EPA, are they the only ones, and do they have the money they need to regulate our water and our earth with the changes that's happening with the oil and the fracking?
Yeah, here's the problem with the EPA.
And how is it, if it isn't EPA, our oil and our earth and our water protected with what's happening with the oil? You know, with regulations somewhere.
Well, I think it depends on your vision of who's responsible for those. First of all, the EPA and its vision was never to be a regulatory agency and an enforcement agency. It was to come up with standards, it was to come up with policies that were pushed to the states, not pushed to the states, but recommended to the states, and the states had the authority. Under the idea of the founding fathers is the government's powers, the federal government's powers were very limited, but the state's powers were only limited by the will of the people. So in other words, as much power as that the people wanted to yield to the state government, they could. But the federal government was limited to these powers, and unless it has to deal with interstate commerce, there was no authority of the federal government to regulate. I guarantee you, Georgia Environmental Protection Division is much better qualified to deal with Georgia's waterways than some bureaucrat in Washington who has never even visited Georgia. He doesn't know how much water our farmers need to irrigate. They have no idea the impact. Their vision is you've got a big plant that's dumping sewage in every waterway. And look, I kayak and canoe and fish in these lakes and streams around here. They're pretty clean. As Americans, we do a pretty good job today of policing ourselves. So the problem, though, with the EPA is the way that this fourth branch of government has evolved is we could literally cut all funding to EPA, and they would still continue to operate because of the fees and the penalties and the fines they assess. They're operating under those. The Constitution says the Congress allocates all revenues. But right now, these agencies are getting their own money and they're operating themselves, and we have very little control. That's one of the things that Article 1 is going to be doing is all revenues that are collected through fines and fees and penalties should go to the General Treasury. That's what happens, that's what Trey deals with in the General Assembly. And one of the complaints a lot of people have had is you can pass a bill like we had, there was one that we were dealing with trauma care. We were going to raise speeding fines and all that money was going to go to trauma care. The problem is that money can't go to trauma care. Under the Constitution, it has to go to the General Treasury and the legislature allocate where it goes. So they actually had to do a constitutional amendment to change that. That's really the way it works. You got to put the onus on the back of the elected officials. What happens is elected officials don't like making difficult decisions. So they like to kick that can on to somebody else. But this is what's happened. So we've got to rein in that spending, rein in these agencies. You look like you're into that.
Well, it wasn't a question, but I just kind of piggybacking on that. Before the EPA worries about Georgia's waters, they have about 3 million gallons of toxic sludge that they dumped into the Animas River in Colorado that they got to worry about. So
yeah, you go on my website.
The EPA that did that to Colorado and to hundreds of miles of rivers downstream. So, in my opinion, the less the EPA does, the better.
And did you know EPA has SWAT teams? Armed SWAT. The Department of Education has armed SWAT teams. The Department of Labor has armed SWAT teams. These guys are not they're not law enforcement agencies. That's another area we're going to be going after, duplication of services. If the EPA actually has to enforce a law that was passed by Congress, not a policy, because they don't have the authority to pass a law, right? But if somebody is violating a law passed by Congress and the EPA needs to enforce it, they need to call the sheriff's office over here. They need to call the FBI. They don't need to come into this jurisdiction with a SWAT team. They shouldn't even have a SWAT team. So these are some of the areas of duplication that we're going after. Yes, ma'am.
I had one other question. With the list of achievements that you shared with us, was there any opportunity to do anything for our veterans at this time to improve their care?
In fact, we, I have to look it up. We out of the House, we passed 21 bills. Everything from providing more veteran services to reforming the VA. It's not enough. In my opinion, this is the direction we're going. We should split the VA into two different aspects. One on the benefit side, and the other is just totally get rid of all the VA hospitals and give a voucher card to veterans. Why should they have some substantive care benefits? Why should somebody come into this country illegally get better health care than a veteran who fought for this nation? That's the direction that we need to go. But again, that's not going to happen overnight. That's not going to happen this year. It's not going to happen next year, but it has to be a goal that we have and build a path to get there. Those are some of the bigger issues that, because we never set a long-term goal, and one of the reasons we haven't, because we're afraid we live in a microwave society today. It's got to happen now. I mean, grab a box of Pop-Tarts, look at the instructions. It says, take out one of the pastries, put it in the toaster oven for 1 minute. But if you don't have 60 seconds, put it in the microwave for 10. I mean, this is the society we live in. We don't even have 60 seconds to wait for breakfast. We got to nuke it in 3 seconds to get out the door. So that's the society we live in. We always want everything right now, and nothing. We've got into this that if it's too far out there, it's not worth working for. But we've got to change that. We've got to start moving in the right direction. Couple more?
Yeah, let's take two more questions and that's all.
Yeah.
This may be a little off topic, but I know you're probably more in the know. I keep seeing Russia, to me, kind of as a threat. You see Putin claiming all the way to the North Pole. He's dropping things under water to claim this. He's keeps pushing the envelope. The Ukraine, which you've been to, you know, the U.S. and I think England, maybe there's one other. We agreed if they gave up their nukes, we'd protect that. You know, we basically let them overrun that. How much of a threat do you see Russia?
It's significant. That's why lifting the oil export ban was so huge, because if you think about Iran, everybody's mind is upon the billions, the $105 billion that they've got that we've had told, tied up. That pales into what that they're going to be able to bring in by exporting oil. And the higher the oil price, the more profit you get. Same with Russia. Their military is funded by their oil exports, so the higher the barrel higher price per barrel the oil price is, the more profit that they get that goes into the military. Now we can actually control some of that profit. But yeah, Russia is a very significant threat to us. Here's one of the things with ISIS. Back in May, I traveled to 8 different countries in 11 days as part of the counterterrorism task force. We learned a lot of things there. One of the things, the only way we're going to be able to stop ISIS and contain ISIS, or not contained, the only way we're going to be able to stop ISIS, and we hate to say this, we hate to admit it, we're going to have soldiers on the ground. You're not going to win a war by dropping bombs on people. It's going to take putting our boots on the ground and fighting this nation. They are not a terrorist organization. They are not. Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization. They exist to enact terror upon Christians and Jews in the West, and even Muslims now. ISIS, they're a nation state. They have territory. They have an economy. They have a government. They occupy portions of several countries. We have to fight them as if we were fighting Nazi Germany, because they are a radical government. The only difference is Hitler believed in a master race. They believe in a master faith. It's the same extreme ideology. The only way you're going to fight it is boots on the ground. We just made that much more difficult because now Russia is operating in Syria as well. So if we're to actually put boots on the ground, it's going to be harder to create an international coalition, and it's going to be more difficult because now we got to check our 6 for Russian jets coming at us as well. When I was in Europe, we were meeting with members of the European Union, delegates from several different countries, and we went to dinner with them. And our discussion was terrorism, but they kept wanting to go back and talk about trade, free trade. They desperately want a free trade agreement, Europe does, with the United States. Because they say terrorism is bad, but Putin is a greater threat to ours, and if Putin can control the trade in Europe, then NATO is in great jeopardy. Their biggest fear was Putin. They're watching him very closely of what's going on. So that's another aspect. When you start looking at foreign policy, it's not always having the bigger boats, guns, ships, and airplanes than the other guy. It's not always just having the bigger army, the more powerful army. It's other factors as well that go into geo-economic factors where you can influence the economies of other nations as well. And trade is one of those. One of the things we're going to be dealing with is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP. We've already lined up in the Republican Party for and against it, and we hadn't even read it yet. I don't know where I am on it. But it's not going to happen under this presidency. We've already determined that. It may, but Ryan is saying we're not going to push on it during this presidency. We just don't trust him. But brings up one other illustration of how the left has co-opted us to fight against each other. When I first got to Washington, D.C., all the outside conservative groups, Heritage, Club for Growth, Cato Institute, all these different groups started coming to our office, and they started talking to me about this thing called Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, and how important that was. They were promoting TPA. And they said it's going to be controversial, but we really need this because it allows the president to go and negotiate. Well, he can already go and negotiate a trade agreement, but what this does is Basically says if the president negotiates it's under the guidelines of Congress, then he gets an up or down vote on the trade deal without amendments. So he said it's going to be controversial because of people thinking it's empowering the president. But these are the conservative groups, libertarian groups, even saying we need this TPA because free trade is a conservative policy. When it came down to it, a lot of them got really quiet because it became very controversial. Now, we changed the TPA to even give more control over the president, put it to where we could turn off TPA and we could amend the bill. But we also made it for the first time in American history that the American people get to see the bill at the same time, well, the agreement. The American people get to see the agreement at the same time Congress does. It's no longer held secret. It used to be that it went to Congress and it would remain secret until Congress passed it. It's been that way because trade deals are very touchy. So we said, no, if we're going to do this, then the American people have the right to see what we're going to be doing. And so it required it to be made public for at least 60 days before Congress could even act. It's been out there since September, October. The interesting thing is we're moving closer, hadn't decided on TPA, all of a sudden conservative talk show hosts are out there against TPA. You got conservative writers, Breitbart's writing articles against TPA, and they're using the same talking points that the liberal left that was coming into office were using against TPA. And I'm thinking, wait a second, here we are on the conservative side, you just make arguments as the Democrats, what has happened? And then I find out that there is this ingenious thing that was put up called ObamaTrade.com. You want to kill something? For the conservatives, put Obama in front of it. And I start looking at it, well, ObamaTrade.com in conservative language is using the same talking points that the liberal left was using, and I told my chief of staff, Rob, I said, somehow we've been co-opted by the left. 2 days later, the Free Beacon comes out exposing the guy who started ObamaTrade.com that all the talk show hosts were referencing, all the conservative pundits were referencing, was actually a far left-wing activist of the Democratic Party who figured out if we get them divided, then we can stop this thing from happening. I was sitting in a committee meeting, just chatting with some, sit in committee, you get to know some of the Democrats in there, and I was chatting with some. We were just talking about the speaker's race. This was during the transition period, and they were talking about, they were going to have a candidate, they knew they were going to win, and we're just kind of, well, who you guys comfortable with, all this, but one of them told me, he said, the one that we don't want would be Paul Ryan. So why? He said, because he's a conservative, but he's articulate, he is charismatic, and he can unify you guys. I said, really? He said, yeah, that's just what I'm hearing is the one that we don't want. This one, Paul wasn't even running. When Paul decided to run, who was the first three to endorse it? Harry Reid, Nancy Pelosi, and Barack Obama. I actually went on national radio. I said, why do you think they endorsed him to try to stop him? They have learned how to drive a division between us, and they've been doing it very, very effectively. So I'd say, double check your resources before you get on the Facebook and you start condemning people, because we live in a society too where there's a whole lot of courage behind the keyboard. So, yes, sir.
One last question concerning healthcare in this
Right.
country. I'm a small business owner, and 2014 we saw prices increase 50%. 2015 they doubled
Right.
from 2014, and it's chewing up all the profit. It's really crushing small businesses, specifically mine.